I want to tell you about the day I found out my family was not what I thought it was. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, staring at a screen, reading a result that did not make sense. The DNA test said my sister Carol was not related to anyone in our family. Not to me. Not to our brother James. Not to our mother Ruth, who had raised us all in the same house for 30 years. Carol shared 0% of her DNA with any of us. I sat at that table for a very long time. And then I started to understand that the secret was not Carol's. The secret was our mother's. And what our mother Ruth had done, what she had hidden for 42 years, with a patience and a precision that I still find difficult to fully comprehend, was the thing that would take me 18 months to unravel completely. This is that story. Chapter 1, The Beginning. My name is Susan. I am the middle child of 3. My older brother James is 51. I am 48. My younger sister Carol is 44. We grew up in a small house in a quiet neighborhood with parents who were, by any ordinary measure, a normal family. Our father Edward worked in insurance. Our mother Ruth taught elementary school for 30 years. They were married for 47 years before our father died of a heart attack when I was 39. I want to describe my family honestly, because the story I am about to tell you requires that you understand who these people were before I understood who they actually were. James was always the responsible one. Steady, careful, the kind of older brother who remembered birthdays and fixed things around the house and gave good advice without being asked. James married a woman named Patricia when he was 26, and they have been together ever since. 2 children, now teenagers. Carol was the youngest, and the most vivid. She had our mother's dark hair and our father's stubbornness and a laugh that could fill any room. Carol worked as a graphic designer, lived alone, had a wide circle of friends and a dog named Chester who she treated like a small person. And then there was me. Susan. The middle child who became a high school biology teacher, which is, looking back, a detail rich with irony. I spent 30 years teaching genetics to teenagers and did not know the most important genetic fact about my own family. The DNA test was Carol's idea. She had given James and me kits for Christmas, one of those consumer ancestry tests, the kind that tells you what percentage Irish you are and whether you have Viking ancestry. Carol had done hers the previous year and discovered she was apparently 23% Scandinavian, which she found hilarious given that our family was entirely from Central Europe as far as anyone knew. James did his kit first. Then I did mine. We shared our results with each other through the testing company's app, the way families do, comparing percentages, finding distant cousins we had never heard of, laughing at the unexpected results. And then Carol shared hers. And I saw something that made me go very still. Carol's ethnicity results were completely different from James's and mine. Completely. Where James and I were predominantly Eastern European with some German and a small percentage of British, Carol's results showed a majority of Italian and Southern Mediterranean ancestry. Different families. Entirely different geographical origins. I told myself there was an explanation. I told myself the tests were imperfect, that there was a margin of error, that this meant nothing. Then I looked at the DNA relationship matches. James and I showed up in each other's results as full siblings. We showed up in our distant cousins' results. The connections were exactly what they should be for 2 people who share both biological parents. Carol did not show up in any of our matches. Not as a sibling. Not as a half-sibling. Not as a distant cousin. Carol's DNA matches were a completely different set of people. People none of us had ever heard of. I closed the app. I sat with my cold coffee for a long time. And then I called James. Chapter 2, The Betrayal. James did not believe me at first. This is understandable. What I was telling him was not the kind of thing a person accepts easily. I was telling him that our sister, the woman we had grown up with, shared holidays with, argued with, and loved for 44 years, was not biologically related to us. James said, "The tests are wrong. They're consumer products. They're not accurate." I said, "James, I teach biology. I know how these tests work. The margin of error doesn't account for zero shared DNA. Zero is not a margin of error. Zero means something." There was a long silence. James said, "What does it mean?" I said, "I don't know yet. But I think we need to find out." What followed was a conversation that neither of us had ever imagined having. We talked carefully, slowly, trying to map the possibilities. The most obvious explanation, the one that neither of us wanted to say aloud, was that Carol had been adopted and our parents had never told her. Or told any of us. This was possible. Our mother Ruth was still alive, living in the house we had grown up in, at 76 years old. She was sharp, healthy, independent. We could simply ask her. But James and I both knew Ruth. And we both understood, without saying it explicitly, that if Ruth had kept this secret for 44 years, she had kept it deliberately. And that asking her directly would give her the chance to decide how much of the truth to share. I did not want Ruth's version of the truth. I wanted the actual truth. So before I said anything to anyone, before I told Carol, before I confronted Ruth, I decided to find out as much as I could on my own. I was a biology teacher. Research was what I did. Chapter 3, The Decision. I want to tell you about the 8 weeks between when I saw Carol's DNA results and when I finally understood what had actually happened. Those 8 weeks were among the strangest of my life. I was carrying an enormous secret while going to work every day, teaching genetics to 16-year-olds, sitting across from my mother at Sunday dinners, watching Carol post photographs of Chester on social media. Everything looked exactly the same. Nothing was. I started with what I had, Carol's DNA matches on the testing app. These were real biological relatives of Carol's who had also taken the test. Most of them were distant, 4th and 5th cousins, but there were a few closer matches. 2nd cousins. 1 first cousin once removed. I began carefully, methodically, reaching out to these matches through the app's messaging system. I did not tell them what I was looking for. I said I was researching family history and was trying to understand some unexpected results. A woman named Elena responded within 2 days. Elena was 62 years old and lived in another state. She was, according to the DNA results, Carol's first cousin once removed. Which meant that one of Elena's parents was Carol's biological grandparent. Elena was friendly and curious and completely unaware that she was about to help me unravel something that would change my understanding of my entire family. We exchanged several messages. Elena shared her family tree. She had done extensive genealogy research and had a detailed record going back several generations. And in that family tree, I found a name I recognized. A woman named Margaret, born in 1942. Elena's aunt. Margaret would have been 34 in 1968. My mother Ruth was born in 1948. She would have been 20 in 1968. Carol was born in 1982. But there was a man in Elena's family tree connected to Margaret, a man named Thomas, Margaret's son, born in 1965. Thomas would have been 17 in 1982. The year Carol was born. I sat with that information for a very long time. And then I hired a genealogist. Her name was Dr. Patricia Nolan, and she specialized in exactly this kind of research, what she called unexpected family connections. She had helped, she told me, many families navigate what the DNA testing industry had started calling NP events, not parent expected. I told Patricia everything. The DNA results. Elena. Thomas. Patricia was calm and methodical and did not express any judgment about what I was uncovering. She said, "Let me see what I can find." 3 weeks later, Patricia called me. Chapter 4: The Evidence. What Patricia found was this. Thomas, the son of Margaret from Elena's family tree, had lived in our city in the early 1980s. He had been 19 years old in 1982, not 17, I had miscalculated slightly, and he had worked at a hardware store 2 miles from the house where my mother Ruth had been living at the time. Thomas had left the city in 1983. Patricia had traced him to another state, where he had married, had children, and lived an entirely ordinary life until his death in 2019. Thomas did not know he had a daughter named Carol. Or if he knew, he had never acknowledged it. But the DNA did not lie. Thomas's son, Carol's half-brother, a man named Robert who had also done a DNA test, showed up in Carol's results as a half-sibling match. 50% shared DNA. The relationship was unambiguous. Carol's biological father was Thomas. Which meant that in 1981 or early 1982, my mother Ruth had an affair with a 19-year-old man who worked at a hardware store. And when Carol was born, Ruth had raised her as Edward's daughter. Our father Edward, who had died without ever knowing. Or, and this was the possibility that kept me awake at night, our father Edward, who had known, and had chosen to love Carol anyway. I did not know which was true. I needed to find out. And there was only one person who could tell me. I called my mother Ruth on a Thursday morning and asked if I could come for lunch. She said of course, she would make sandwiches. I drove to her house with Patricia's report on the passenger seat and a feeling in my stomach that I can only describe as the sensation of standing at the edge of something very large. I sat across from Ruth at the kitchen table where I had eaten 1,000 meals. And I said, "Mom, I need to talk to you about Carol's DNA test." Ruth put down her sandwich. She looked at me for a long moment. And then she said, "I always thought this day would come eventually." What Ruth told me over the next 2 hours, calmly, carefully, in the same voice she had used to tell us bedtime stories, was not what I had expected. Ruth had not hidden Carol's paternity out of shame or selfishness. She had hidden it because Edward had asked her to. Edward had known. He had known from the beginning. Ruth had told him when she discovered she was pregnant, had told him everything, had given him the choice to leave. And Edward, who was by every measure the steadiest person I have ever known, had said, "She will be our daughter. And we will never speak of it again." They had kept that promise to each other for 42 years. Until Edward died. And Ruth had carried it alone for the 9 years since. Chapter 5: The Justice. I want to be careful about how I use the word justice here, because what happened next was not the kind of justice that involves courts or legal proceedings or anyone being punished. It was a different kind of justice. The quieter kind. The kind that comes from the truth finally being known by the people who needed to know it. I told James first. We sat in his kitchen and I walked him through everything, Patricia's research, Elena, Thomas, and finally what Ruth had told me. James was very quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Dad knew. All those years, he knew and he never treated her any differently." And I thought, no. He never did. We talked about whether to tell Carol. This was the hardest question. Carol had grown up as our sister. She had loved Edward as her father, completely, without reservation, in the way that children love the parent who is present and patient and devoted, regardless of biology. Edward had been all of those things to Carol. Did she need to know that he was not her biological father? Did she need to know that her biological father was a man named Thomas who had died in 2019 without ever acknowledging her? James and I talked about it for a long time. We went back and forth. We brought Ruth into the conversation. And eventually we decided that the decision was not ours to make. It was Carol's. Carol had the right to know her own origins. She was a 44-year-old adult. The truth about her DNA was already sitting in an app on her phone, available to her whenever she chose to look carefully enough to find it. We were not protecting her by keeping the secret. We were just continuing it. I drove to Carol's apartment on a Saturday morning. Chester greeted me at the door. Carol made tea. And I told her. Carol was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "Dad knew?" I said, "Yes. From the beginning. He chose you." Carol looked out the window for a moment. Then she said something I have thought about every day since. She said, "Then he was my father." Biology doesn't change that. He chose me. That's what fathers do. I did not say anything. I just sat there with my tea and my sister and the dog who was trying to get onto the couch. Carol did reach out to Robert, Thomas's son. Her half-brother. They have met twice now, carefully, curiously, two adults navigating an unexpected connection. Carol says he seems like a decent man. She is not sure yet what he will be to her. She is taking it slowly. Ruth is still in the house we grew up in. She is 76 and sharp, and sometimes, when I visit her on Sunday afternoons, I think about the weight she carried for 42 years, the secret she and Edward agreed to keep, the love that was underneath it, the decision they made together before Carol was even born. I do not judge my mother for what she did. I am not sure I have the right to. I understand that she was 20 years old and frightened, and that the man she loved offered her a way through something impossible. I do not judge Edward either. I understand now that what he did was not weakness or denial. It was a choice. A clear-eyed, deliberate choice to love a child who needed to be loved. What I carry is something more complicated than judgment. It is wonder, I think. That a secret can live inside a family for 42 years. That it can sit at every holiday table, be present in every photograph, breathe the same air as the people who do not know it. And that the truth, when it finally comes out, can be, not devastating. Just true. I teach biology. I know that DNA is not the whole story of what makes a family. I know that better now than I ever did before. Thank you for being here for this story. New story every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. If this reached someone who needed to hear it today, please share it. I will see you in the next one. There is more I want to tell you, because I have left out the part that is hardest to explain. The part about what it felt like to be me during those 8 weeks of research. I want to tell you about a specific Sunday dinner. It was about 4 weeks into my investigation. I had already found Elena, already spoken to Patricia Nolan, already had a good sense of where the evidence was pointing. But I had not yet confirmed everything. And I had not yet spoken to Ruth. I sat at my mother's table that Sunday. Carol was there, laughing about something Chester had done that week. James was there, talking to Patricia about their teenagers. Ruth was moving between the kitchen and the dining room, the way she had done at every Sunday dinner for as long as I could remember. And I sat there knowing something that no one else in that room knew. I knew that Carol's father was not the man in the photographs on the wall. I knew that somewhere in another state, Carol had a half-brother named Robert who had no idea she existed. I knew that my mother had carried a secret for 42 years and that it was sitting in the room with us, invisible, as real and present as the food on the table. I did not say anything. I passed the bread and asked Carol about her latest design project and laughed at the right moments. And drove home afterward feeling the particular loneliness of knowing something that changes everything, before you are ready to change anything. I want to say something about that loneliness, because I think it is important. When you discover something that upends your understanding of your own family, there is a period, sometimes short, sometimes long, when you are the only one who knows. When you are living in two realities simultaneously. The reality everyone else inhabits, where the family is what it has always appeared to be. And the reality you have discovered, where nothing is quite what it seemed. That period is very hard. Not because the truth is necessarily terrible, in our case, as it turned out, the truth was complicated but not cruel. But because carrying it alone, while continuing to participate in the ordinary routines of family life, requires a kind of sustained performance that is exhausting in a way that is difficult to describe. I think about this when I think about Ruth. Ruth carried that performance for 42 years. Not 8 weeks. 42 years. Every Christmas. Every Easter. Every Sunday dinner. Every school play and graduation and wedding and funeral. Every photograph. Every moment when someone looked at Carol and said she had Edward's stubbornness or Ruth's laugh or some combination of the two. Ruth smiled and agreed and said nothing. For 42 years. I do not know if I could have done that. I genuinely do not know. There is one more thing I want to tell you. About a month after I told Carol, she came to visit me on a weekday afternoon, unusual for her. She was normally busy during the week. She brought Chester. We sat in my garden and she was quiet for a while, which was also unusual for Carol, who was rarely quiet. Then she said, "I've been thinking about Thomas." I waited. She said, "I'm not angry at him. I know I probably should be, or maybe people expect me to be. But he didn't know about me. As far as I can tell, he never knew I existed. He didn't make a choice to abandon me. He just moved on, and there was a consequence he never found out about." She looked at Chester for a moment. She said, "The person who made the choice was Dad. He knew. He knew from before I was born. And he chose to be my father anyway. Every single day for 41 years, he made that choice again." I said, "Yes." She said, "I think that's the better story. The one about Thomas is just biology. The one about Dad is about something else." I said, "What?" She said, "About what you decide to do when it would be easier to walk away." I thought about Edward. About the 26-year-old man who had sat across from his wife and heard something that would have given him every justification to leave. And who had said, "She will be our daughter." And who had kept that promise with such completeness, such absolute consistency, that not one of his 3 children had ever had the slightest reason to question it. That is the story I keep coming back to. Not the DNA test. Not Thomas. Not the 42-year secret. The man who made a choice when it was hard, and then made it again every day for the rest of his life without ever once making anyone feel the weight of it. I teach my students about genetics. About how DNA determines so much of who we are, our physical characteristics, our predispositions, our vulnerabilities. But it does not determine this. It does not determine who sits at the table. Who shows up. Who chooses, day after day, to be present. That is not in the DNA. That is in the character. And Edward's character was the best I have ever known. I still have Sunday dinners with Ruth. With James and Patricia. With Carol and Chester, who is now, somehow, allowed on the furniture. We talk about ordinary things. We laugh at ordinary things. And sometimes, when I look around that table, I think about all the things that had to happen, all the choices and accidents and secrets and discoveries that brought us here. And I think, this is still my family. Different than I thought it was. But still mine. Thank you for listening to all of it. One last thing. Robert, Carol's half-brother, Thomas's son, sent Carol a photograph last month. It was a photograph of Thomas, taken sometime in the 1980s. A young man, dark-haired, standing in front of a car, squinting into the sun. Carol texted me the photograph without any message. I looked at it for a long time. And then I understood why she had sent it without words. Because there were no words that quite fit the feeling of looking at the face of someone who gave you life without knowing it. Someone who went on to live an entirely separate existence, had other children, built other things, and never knew that somewhere in the city he had left behind, a little girl named Carol was growing up with dark hair and Edward's stubbornness and a laugh that could fill any room. I texted Carol back, "He would have been lucky to know you." She sent back, "He didn't need to. Dad did." I put my phone down. And I thought about Edward. About all the fathers who choose their children not because biology demands it but because love does. About how the most important things in a family are often the things that are never said, the choices made quietly, without announcement, without expectation of recognition. Edward never told us. Never hinted. Never, in 41 years, gave Carol any reason to feel anything other than completely, unconditionally his. That is the story I want to leave you with. Not the DNA test. Not the secret. The quiet, daily, unglamorous act of choosing someone. Over and over. For a lifetime.